Okay, so we're back with part 3. And just to do a little bit of a recap, we saw how the events on 9/11 were so perfectly mirrored in the skies above, with Saturn and Pluto in their opposition, creating this beautiful mirroring in their signs, creating this astrological picture so perfectly symbolically represented in the events happening beneath them. We also looked at current events in the skies above, this coronavirus crisis, with the conjunction between the exact same two astrological bodies, Saturn and Pluto again, when that aspect of the conjunction is forming, when it's approaching, we get event 201, a simulation of the exact same thing that would happen when that conjunction was formed with the pandemic, and then the aftermath of that as that starts to pass, as the conjunction starts to pass, the aftermath, the new normal. Represented perfectly again with 9/11, when that opposition is approaching, we get another simulation, amalgam Virgo, a simulation again of the exact same thing that would happen when that opposition was formed, terror attack, and then the aftermath when that opposition starts to pass as the planets move on. We get another new normal, which is the war on terror, big tech in airports, the Patriot Act, you name it, etc. Call it a new normal. We also looked at the two planets and their symbolic representation, Pluto being transformation, Saturn being structure, and they're both in the sign of Capricorn. Capricorn represents occupation, business, social foundations, society, and the structure of those things are being transformed with social distancing and the list of all the things that have been impacted, various social aspects, social foundations all being impacted. And we have the release from the World Economic Forum, key player in Event 201, saying that now is the time for a great reset during this coronavirus crisis. And that article from June the 3rd this year states within that article that a reset of our economic and social foundations is possible. Staggering astrology, staggering coincidences. It's all just a big coincidence. Or is it a coincidence? Is it proof that astrology is somehow viable, or is it something else that is happening? So the coming alignments, we were going to get into the coming alignments, and just before I do that, I just want to touch again on the 22nd of March 2020. The day after that, the 23rd of March, is when the Prime Minister gave the coronavirus address to the nation, when this lovely chap gave us this message: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. And just the day before, on the 22nd, Saturn had reached that 0-degree line of Aquarius. That was our last day of normal, when Saturn reached that 0-degree line, and then the day after we get the UK lockdown. Then sometime later, on the 10th of May 2020, we get another address to the nation from the UK Prime Minister. That's when this message changed to this, when the stay at home message changed to stay alert, control the virus, save lives. And then just a couple of days later, on the 12th of May, Saturn goes retrograde. And all retrograde means is that from the perspective of the Earth, it looks as though that planet is going backwards. It's not really, it's an illusion, but it's considered a retrograde influence. On ephemeris charts, it will have a little R next to it usually. And one of the main influences of a retrograde planet is particularly with a planet like Saturn, one of the malefic planets, the more malefic planets, it's said to be a negative influence, said to negatively impact society or the individual, depending on what kind of chart you're reading. And just to confirm that's on the 12th of May 2020. That's when, well, a couple of days before, on the 10th of May, that's when the message changed in the revised address to the nation, when the Prime Minister revised the lockdown from this to this. And this particular address on the 10th of May was universally panned. It was seen as divisive, confusing, vague. Key members from politics said that the same thing. The Labour Party leader said that the statement raised more questions than it answered. It was also said to be confusing and dangerous. And this was given just before Saturn went retrograde. And I thought that was a key piece of astrology to put in there. That just as this speech is given, Saturn is about to go retrograde, a malefic planet with a negative retrograde influence, and his speech was universally condemned. Interesting astrology, that, I think. Then we had on the 28th of May 2020 another Prime Minister speech on the 5 key tests, when the Prime Minister gave an update on the progress of each of these 5 tests. That was given on the 28th of May 2020. 66 days after lockdown began, that speech was given on the 28th of May. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. So these 5 key steps, these five key tests were all said to have been met. And one of the statements from the Prime Minister in that 28th of May address was that all non-essential shops were to reopen from the 15th of June. Just to confirm that there. That was confirmed in a speech on the 28th of May, 66 days after lockdown began. That is when the next day Saturn is back at that 0 degree line. Again, very interesting astrology. Saturn reaches that 0 degree line of Aquarius, the beginning of Aquarius. The next day, lockdown happens. Then it's revised. Then Saturn goes retro, and we get that universal condemnation of the speech on the 10th of May. And then when it's announced that the lockdown and the restrictions will be eased, the next day of that date that things are set to go sort of back to normal, Saturn is back at that 0 degree line. Again, amazing astrology, that, I think. Also confirmed as happening on June 15th, face masks will become compulsory on public transport. And when I heard about this, it reminded me of something that I'd read just before this was announced. But just to confirm, that first mandatory face masks when shops reopen, just as Saturn is back at that 0 degree line. But just going on to what I did read and what it reminded me of when mandatory face masks were announced, it reminded me of this. And I'll just read that first little bit there. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. And it talks about a pandemic happening and how China was key in bringing about restrictions and lockdowns. And that, of course, is in this document, Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development, from the Rockefeller Foundation. released in May 2010. And just a little snippet from that. Given the uncertainty about how the future will play out, how can we best position ourselves not just to identify technologies that improve the lives of poor communities, but also to help scale and spread those that emerge? And how will the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political conditions of the future enable or inhibit our ability to do so? Scenario planning is a methodology designed to help guide groups and individuals through exactly this creative process. The process begins by identifying forces of change in the world, then combining those forces in different ways to create a set of diverse stories or scenarios about how the future could evolve. And that is from May 2010. And these are the scenarios that they come up with, these 4 scenarios. The possibilities of the future of the world. And just a little bit about those, little synopses of each possible scenario of the future as they saw it back in 2010. One in particular is called Lockstep. I'm sure you've heard about it, but it says a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. And it talks about a pandemic happening in 2012. This is written in 2010, so obviously this is a future scenario that they could envision as happening. And it talks about how it had a deadly effect on economies, international mobility of both people and goods. They screeched to a halt. Shops lay empty for months and office buildings, etc. And it talks about how countries suffered a pandemic. It was catastrophic in certain places. Disproportionate numbers died in various countries. But China in particular fared a lot better. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as it played out in the actuality of this projected scenario, with China being the country of origin of this virus and the first to lock down as well. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. We also have this in this document as well. Whenever national interests clashed with individual interests, there was conflict. Sporadic pushback became increasingly organized and coordinated as disaffected youth and people who had seen their status and opportunities slip away largely in developing countries incited civil unrest. We also saw that as well recently. Just another coincidence, I'm sure. And again, social foundations now are being changed, or at least being pledged to be changed. The police is going to be supposedly dismantled in Minneapolis after the riots, protests, whatever you want to call them. And the whole of the police, some politicians are calling for reforms in the wake of police brutality protests. Residents of some cities are demanding departments be stripped of their budgets or dissolved altogether. Another strange mirroring of the planetary influence of Pluto, the transformation of the planetary elements of Saturn, structure, in Capricorn, social foundation, society, occupation, all being transformed, or at least being pledged to be transformed. Back to that document, it's just a little bit about how technology is going to be seen in the future back in 2010. Have a little read of that. Scanners using advanced functional magnetic resonance imaging technology become the norm at airports and other public areas to detect abnormal behavior. Yeah, technology is going to start, according to these guys at the Rockefeller Foundation, it's going to detect abnormal behavior. So get practicing your normal behavior, folks. But yeah, we saw that. We've seen that with the variant systems. I did a little video many years ago now called the penny drops. It's still on this channel, where variant systems were already in place. I made that back in 2007 or 8, I believe, about the cashless society. And variant systems look for the abnormal behavior of shoppers in supermarkets, which at the moment is full of abnormal behavior, or at least new normal behavior. But have a read through those. We've got new diagnostics developed to detect communicable diseases. Think the COVID Pass, track and trace apps, the contact tracing apps, etc. And we've obviously seen headlines where they're going to start using temperature checkers at airports on the back of this coronavirus. And that's, of course, in this document, the mandatory wearing of face masks and body temperature checks at communal spaces. And the question to ask, really, I think, is, as well as mandatory face masks being mandatory on the back of this coronavirus, when are we going to see temperature checkpoints? Are we going to see those? If we do see those, do we know that that document is the playbook? Do we know that this is part of a plan, perhaps? Or is it all just astrological synchronicity? Or is it all just a big coincidence? Let me know what you think in the comments. So I think this is very interesting, this bracketing here of these events. Saturn at the 0 degree line of Aquarius. Then the lockdown happens. The lockdown is revised. Saturn goes retrograde. And then the lockdown is eased somewhat, but with new normal lockdown ideas in place. And then Saturn goes back to that 0 degree line, exactly where it was when lockdown first came in. Again, I think that's just really interesting astrology. And I wanted to bring it at this point, just going back to December 2017, when Saturn enters Capricorn, where it's been making this conjunction with Pluto in that sign. When Saturn entered Capricorn in December 2017, we had this article from the New York Times, and that's of a virus, and it says here, a colorized electron micrograph of the coronavirus that causes Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. Federal officials ended a moratorium imposed on funding research that alters viruses like this one to become more lethal. From Reuters. In the New York Times, just to confirm the headline, a federal ban on making lethal viruses is lifted. And that was released on December 19th, 2017. Federal officials on Tuesday ended a moratorium imposed 3 years ago on funding research that alters germs to make them more lethal. Such work can now proceed, said Dr. Francis Collins. And just a little bit more down there. Critics say these researchers risk creating a monster germ that could escape the lab and seed a pandemic. That is when Saturn enters Capricorn, when it's at the 0 degree line. And then when it's at the end of Capricorn, we have that happening. Again, amazing astrology. No, it's just a coincidence. Or is it something else? So just to kind of represent that pictorially, there we have Saturn entering Capricorn when that virus moratorium is lifted back in 2017. It reaches the end of Capricorn and a global pandemic sweeps the world. And the same thing really happened on the events around 9/11. Again, we get that mirroring of the sky-ground events happening in both scenarios involving the same two astrological bodies. When Saturn sat just on the edge of Gemini before it starts to make that opposition, Saturn was at that 0 degree line of Gemini in September 2000. That's when this document is released. The project for the new American century, rebuilding America's defenses. And the famous quote from that, the famous line from that, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard, is that this one: further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. This document was released when Saturn was at the exact 0 degree line of Gemini in September 2000. The PNAT document is released, mentions a new Pearl Harbor. Then Saturn starts to approach that opposition. We get Amalgam Virgo. Then we get 9/11, which was called the new Pearl Harbor. And then the war on terror, new surveillance tech, call it the new normal. Again, with this coronavirus and Saturn sitting on that 0 degree line of Capricorn, in December 2017, a virus moratorium ended. Then Saturn starts to make its way through Capricorn, meeting Pluto, transiting Pluto, and then we get the exact same play out of events happening. The monster germ could escape the lab, then we get event 201, then we get the event itself, and then we get the new normal. Again, amazing sky ground situation. It's accurate astrology. Is astrology some kind of esoteric discipline that defies current scientific beliefs about it? Is all this just a coincidence, or is it something else? Let me know what you think in the comments. So, coming alignments. We'll get there eventually. I just want to mention again that Pluto conjunct with Saturn at the moment. Obviously we know about that, but all the way through really these events, Jupiter has also been conjunct with these planets. Jupiter really entered the party, became conjunct with Pluto, and to a certain degree Saturn when it got to 23, 24 degrees of Capricorn. That was the end of March, and then Saturn, obviously at that point, is at the 0 degree of Aquarius. And just to reiterate there, Jupiter is conjunct with Pluto round about the end of March in Capricorn. Then all these planets went retrograde. And again, retrograde just means it looks as though they're going backwards through the sky. Jupiter went retrograde on the 15th of May 2020, Saturn on the 12th of May 2020, and Pluto on the 26th of April 2020. They will go forward again. They will go direct again on these dates, on or around these dates. Jupiter on the 13th of September, Saturn on the 29th of September, and Pluto on the 5th of October. That's when they go direct again. They reach these degrees in their retrograde motion before they go direct again. And that is the autumn, fall time. And I think it's important to just take a look at this period in November this year when the planets are direct again, as Jupiter in this column, makes its way to be conjunct with Pluto and then passes Pluto, is transformed by Pluto. Saturn obviously ahead of Pluto at this point, but Jupiter making that final approach to Pluto And will it be transformed? What will we see? Will we see anything during this period between the 8th and the 14th of November? We have yet to see. But we're being told that around about that time in the fall, another wave of coronavirus is likely in the fall. We're being told that by many mainstream media outlets, many scientists, academics, etc. all seem to be on board with this second wave in the fall later this year. Or maybe it'll be the vaccine. Maybe the vaccine will come along as well as the second wave. Those helpful people at Morgan Stanley have said that they can see that happening. You can trust Morgan Stanley and all kinds of establishments like that. And Pfizer as well, those helpful people at Pfizer and other big pharmaceutical companies, when they say that it's likely the coronavirus vaccine could be ready in the autumn in the race to beat the pandemic. And packed beaches, of course, people going to the beaches, they have obviously been blamed for this coming second wave. Just another confirmation of that. Matt Hancock saying that's what will happen. Britain's beaches, all packed because of the mini heat wave we had here. They could fuel the second coronavirus wave. And they may have to be locked down, Britain's beaches, because of that. It's not anything like Agenda 21, that. If you believe that, then obviously you're a conspiracy theorist. Locking down nature reserves or beaches and things like that is nothing like Agenda 21. And if you think that, you've just polished your tinfoil hat too vigorously, I'm afraid. If it does happen, if the second wave happens, it's not these. This isn't the cause. You can't blame these people. That would be wrong to do that. Although some people say that that's what will happen, or if it does happen, that would be the cause. Apart from these people, 1,000 health professionals, they signed a letter saying that they shouldn't shut the protest down using coronavirus concerns. You shouldn't do that. 1,000 health professionals all signed a letter saying that. This didn't matter, though. This didn't matter. And we all remember this inset. And if the second wave comes, blame the beaches. Blame people on beaches, I think is the message. And we're already seeing today, actually, this coming out today from Forbes, fears of a second wave lead to Beijing lockdown this time. So some people are certainly expecting this to happen. And we get to the big one. We get to the big alignment. Actually, no, first I'm going to just talk about this. And I'm going to just switch here to just a normal representation of an astrological zodiac wheel. The summer solstice, just a few days away now. I think this is an important alignment in many ways. We get the sun and moon here conjunct in the sign of Cancer. Mother and father there in the sign of the mother, making this aspect to Mars and the big conjunction that's happening at the end of Capricorn. I thought this stood out as another one of those astrological configurations during this year that seem really important. And for some reason, it just made me think of this. I don't know why. The Freemasonic bride, the chair of the bride, the Freemasonic bride's chair, or the 47th problem of Euclid. Thought that was what this reminded me of. And there's also an eclipse on the solstice, the summer solstice this year, when a corona will be seen in the sky. by some people in the world during this coronavirus. Maybe that's just a coincidence. That's happening on the summer solstice as well. And this is the path that eclipse will take, going through Africa and eventually into China, going the totality path going very, very close to Wuhan. Another huge coincidence there. So yeah, now the big one. I got ahead of myself then. This is the big astrological significance, I think, of this year. Saturn at this 0 degree line of Aquarius will be met by Jupiter on the exact same degree, and that will be known as the grand mutation. It's a hugely important astrological event, this, and I'm going to get into that in the next episode. And this grand mutation, the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, that will happen on the winter solstice this year. Many people are anticipating this, and I'm going to get into this in the next episode, why I think this is hugely significant, hugely symbolic, and what it's symbolic of. And I'm going to be doing that. And again, this happens in the winter, and again, we're being told that in the winter, this second wave could happen. Second, more deadly wave of coronavirus to hit Europe this winter. Again, from another source there. And we're going to be facing the darkest winter, we're being told by certain people. But I'm going to get into all of that in part 4. And again, thanks for watching.